When I was a young boy, my family owned a Kodak Instamatic, a little box of a camera that, in comparison to today's digitals and SLRs, had absolutely no user functions, no focusing or previewing capabilities, no manual overrides, no ability to do anything more than point and shoot. That was its simple, no-nonsense job, the 1960s version of the earlier Brownies and Graflexes that had so dominated the industry in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It was geared toward middle-class families, or, like mine, immigrant working-class families, searching for experiences and trappings that could be said to be middle American. If memory serves, the Instamatic was not a well-cherished object in my family, certainly not on the order of our tiny black and white television, but it came with us most everywhere we went. With its awful flash, it snapped, snapped, snapped at birthday parties, picnics in the park, and most of all, family vacations. As if to confirm a truism in theories of photography, my memories of our family vacations are today mostly structured by the Kodak Instamatic pictures we took during them. I can remember a long trip to see the redwoods and sequoias north of San Francisco only as a single event, standing beneath a tree so large that we could fit our station wagon underneath its split trunk. I've got a picture of it. What we did during the rest of the trip, I haven't a clue. There was, however, one vacation where my memory and the pictures differ. One year, we took a trip to Disneyland. I remember it fondly. The rides were exhilarating, the crowds intoxicating, the various kingdoms, as the theme park was laid out, as involving as a treasure map. Even the silly Disney characters who wandered around the park caught our attention, and we happily, excitedly, paparazzi-like chased after them. The pictures taken by my father, however, tell a different story. In photograph after photograph, my poor mother looks as if she's at her wit's end. How many more pigs could there possibly be, she seems to ask. Where does the Magic Kingdom end? Whatever their mixed feelings about the vacation, my parents sent this picture, along with others from the trip, to our relatives in mainland China. It was part of their responsibility to keep touch with brothers and sisters and distant relatives who, for all kinds of reasons, could not immigrate to the US. It was also, I am quite sure, my father's way of saying that he had somehow made it in America. What those relatives thought of these pictures is hard to say. But keep in mind that this was not long after Mao Zedong had declared the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution and was trying to wipe away any vestige of bourgeois ideas, culture, and customs. And keep in mind that most of my distant relatives had never heard of Disneyland, let alone seen a gigantic walking pig. I like to fantasize that at least one Chinese man, a photographer named Joseph Seng, better known as Seng Huangxi, absolutely no relation of mine, had somehow caught a glimpse of these pictures and saw something compelling in them. Where we saw the experiences of a family vacation, perhaps he saw something about cultural and social ambitions. Where we saw the pursuit of American leisure, perhaps he saw something about the immense cultural and social differences and the uses of photography to elaborate on them. Where we saw vernacular photography in action, he saw the materials for ambitious art. When he immigrated to the US in 1979 and brought his camera with him, he struck out for Disneyland too, as if to explore its cross-cultural meanings and also the many things that made it such a destination for families like mine. And he photographed himself experiencing them. This is my very silly anecdotal way to introduce this session of photography as a global medium and to suggest some of the interests in the papers by our speakers. They are concerned with the international traffic in photographs and early film, the shifting meanings those pictures undergo when they are deposited in entirely different worlds, the many vernacular as well as fine art qualities, persistently but also unstably attached to them, the complicated centrality of families and family memories and making sense of them, and the strange manner in which interpretations develop elsewhere can come back to roost. Our first speaker is Nancy Mathews of Williams College, who will speak on the traffic in early moving pictures between France and the US. Our second speaker is François Brunet of the University of Paris, who will speak on the reception of American photography in France. And our third speaker is Rob Kroes of the University of Amsterdam, who will speak on the shifting international meanings of the Family of Man photography exhibition. afterwards, please join them in a discussion. So let's begin with Nancy.
Good morning, and thank you all for being here on a Saturday morning at 9 o'clock. I'm sure you're all wondering why me. I know I am. Again, I want to thank the organizers, but also congratulate everyone at SAM for a beautiful building, which I've just now gotten to see. And as a previous fellow at the Smithsonian, it's especially meaningful because as a fellow, you get to know all the ins and outs of the building, and this transformation is extraordinary. My talk today is based on work that I've been doing that has resulted in an exhibition that is currently on view. So if you don't mind, I'll plug it a little bit. It's called Moving Pictures, American Art in Early Film, and it opened at the Williams College Museum of Art. It's organized by Williams. It is currently at the Gray Art Gallery in New York, and for Washingtonians, it's going to be at the Phillips next spring, so you'll get a chance to see it. And I wanted to say that originally the title of my talk was The Other American Art in Paris, because I know many of you associate me with Mary Cassatt and that American art in Paris. And this is taking a step aside and talking about moving pictures in Paris. The title, as it is now, American Moving Pictures in an International Context, implies many more sites around the world than just Paris, but I am just talking about Paris. And you'll see this painting upstairs, the one on top, which is a portrait of Thomas Edison. By the time of the 1889 International Exposition in Paris, there was no more famous living American in the world than Thomas Edison. The inventor of the electric light bulb and the phonograph, and he's got a phonograph with him in this portrait, to name only the inventions in popular as opposed to business use. He had made previous triumphant appearances in Paris and had returned now to be feted at the 1889 celebration of world progress. This time, he had a very particular invention percolating in the back of his mind: how to make pictures move. Very often, this story is told purely from a scientific or technological point of view. But today, I would like to give Thomas Edison his proper place in art history. Perhaps there was a time in his life when he was genuinely a science nerd, in the sense of ignoring such soft disciplines as art. But by the late 1880s, he had a profound respect for the power of visual culture of the day. In addition to the importance of drawing within a laboratory setting, that is, every inventor and technician needed to be able to work out his vision in three-dimensional drawings, and the analysis of scientific drawings, particularly in the 19th century, is a whole other paper. But in addition to that, Edison had realized the power of art in selling himself, the Wizard of Menlo Park, the genius of electricity, and the Edison brand. Portraits of Edison abound, from the high art painting above, executed during the 1889 World's Fair by Abraham Archibald Anderson, an American working in Paris, to the photographic portrait by William Dixon on the bottom left, taken in 1893, and a clip from the film Mr. Edison at Work in His Chemical Laboratory of 1897. The atmosphere at Edison's new laboratory in West Orange, New Jersey, was similarly calculated to place Edison in the sphere of the educated, cultural gentlemen of science, in which sumptuous furnishings and art objects, such as the allegorical triumph of electric light, which you see on the left there, which Edison also acquired at the Paris World's Fair of 1889. It was in this environment that the laboratory's inventions were unveiled and demonstrated to the press and select audiences. The cultured appearance of Edison and his inventions were largely the handiwork of William Kennedy Laurie Dixon, whose photograph you see on the left here, a young electrical engineer who had joined the Edison Company in the early 1880s. He had been raised in France by English parents, both of whom had art backgrounds. His father was described as an artist, with a family tie to Virginia on his mother's side. When his father died, the family relocated to Petersburg, Virginia in 1879, where they participated in artistic and musical circles, and sent William off to New York to work for Edison. Dixon soon rose to a position of prominence, not only as a scientist, but as the official photographer of the Edison Company. He also practiced as an artist, as can be seen in his drawing for the cover of his own book, which is on the right, which was the first published history of film in 1895. It was natural for Edison to tap Dixon for the moving pictures project, since he combined the two necessary skills, machine technology and photography. Edison's template for the new invention was his wildly successful phonograph, which could be mass-produced as a piece of furniture, applicable both to a residential and commercial setting. The picture from 1895, whoops. Now there used to be 3 pointers here. I guess this is one, all right. Up here, these are phonograph machines, cabinets on the left. The picture from 1895 shows a row of phonographs on the left which patrons could activate with a coin and listen to music. On the right of the aisle are a series of Dixon's equivalent cabinets for moving pictures, over here, called kinetoscopes. Also conceived of as furniture, the kinetoscope could be sold to individuals or businesses along with the films that will be played inside. The other is a drawing of Edison's first kinetoscope parlor in New York, showing the high culture tone which these parlors aspired to, decorated with pictures, palm trees, and, of course, a bust of Edison. It was an elegant venue for well-dressed New Yorkers. What were the pictures that could be seen inside these cabinets? It was worth it, right? Okay. So, now imagine yourself standing in this kinetoscope parlor, having put your nickel into the slot, and this is what you would see. This is one of the films that you would have seen. This is a film of Eugene Sandow. Many of you probably know him by now. He was an internationally known strongman, bodybuilder, and accomplished feats of strength, and a proponent of physical fitness. The two books that you see on the bottom, on the left is a book called Sandow on Physical Training of 1894, and on the right, his 1900 Strength and How to Obtain It. He was not just a performer, but he was a physiologist and someone who was an advocate for physical fitness and wrote books and established gyms and all that sort of thing. This film was made in 1894 when Sandow was performing in New York, and also has to do with the publication of the book, Sandow on Physical Training. Intimate in scale, many of these films evoked the now very familiar physiological studies that Edward Muybridge had made famous in his series of racehorses from the late 1870s and the grand Animal Locomotion publication in 1887. Muybridge's work served the scientific interests of his patrons, such as Leland Stanford and the physiology professors at the University of Pennsylvania, But in his own mind, it primarily served artistic purposes. It inspired artists like Thomas Eakins and Ernst Meissonier to seek greater accuracy in their drawing of horses, and a whole generation of American and European artists to respond to the new information about the world that hitherto had gone unseen. Now, artists were encouraged to use his work not only in still form, the familiar serial photographs, but also animated in home zoetropes or in Muybridge's own zoopraxiscope projector. Muybridge had invented his own method of animating his photographs through a round glass slide that revolved in a special magic lantern. And what I'm showing you here is not the glass slide, but a lithograph or a chromolithograph that Muybridge marketed for home use, and you could put in your own zoetropic device and see the horses move. So moving pictures were a corollary to Muybridge's still pictures, the way he presented them and the way the world and artists saw them. It was Muybridge who inspired Edison to take on the invention of moving pictures through a series of meetings in 1888. Muybridge's method was limited in many ways. This was just a simple round. That's all you could see in Muybridge's method. And some businessmen, such as J.B. Lippincott, who financed animal locomotion, as well as Edison's phonographs, hoped to persuade Edison to work out a richer solution to moving pictures. Following Muybridge's lead in using moving pictures for artistic purposes, Sandow was an ideal subject. Sandow himself had often served as an artist's model and evoked classical sculpture in his act, seen here in the film, in which he appeared on stage covered with white powder and standing on a classical column. After the previous decade of artists taking such physiological studies seriously, the Sandow films join many photographic academies as subjects for the kind of life drawings we see here in the Sargent drawing and also the William Rimmer pages from Art Anatomy of 1877. Another type of film seen in the kinetoscope parlors in 1894 was what I like to call American genre. Also drawn from the physiological studies of men and women at work, such films as Blacksmithing of 1893 have the slightly archaizing, humorous tone so familiar to Americans. in American genre painting. This example by J.G. Brown from his later work, such as this one called Her Past Record, painted between 1900 and 1905, testifies to the fact that American genre painting was still familiar to American audiences. Although hardly avant-garde by the 1890s, it was beloved and respected as a truly American expression. When blacksmithing was first publicly demonstrated, it was at the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences, now the Brooklyn Museum of Art, where such genre paintings could be found. On the 14th of April, 1894, the first kinetoscope parlor opened in New York, which I already showed you. On October 1st of that same year, 1894, the first kinetoscope parlor opened in Paris, and these parlors were all over the world within a year after that. The approximately 75 films that William Dixon produced that year in West Orange, New Jersey, were the only films that could be seen in the kinetoscope that year and constitute the largest exposure of work by any American artist worldwide. That Dixon thought of his films as art can be attested to by his own representation of them on the cover of the History of the Kinetograph, Kinetoscope, and Kinetophotograph, which was finished in late 1894 and published in 1895. Drawn in a rustic arts and crafts style, the cover shows a man shooting nature. Down here, this little man with a gun. You know, AKA camera, shooting, get it? You know. Shooting nature with the help of a glorious rising sun in the midst of a halo of delicate pieces of paper, seemingly moving or blown about by the wind. In each of these delicately colored drawings, we see the films that he made in the past year. Sandow performing a feat of strength. Here he's lifting a horse. A genre scene of a barber shop, and that's over here. Boxers, scenes from Buffalo Bill's Wild West show, and the Serpentine Dance down here. For the rest of the world, they represented what had become identified with peculiarly American art. Although today, Loie Fuller's image is most closely identified with the French artist Toulouse-Lautrec, she was first and foremost an American phenomenon. And I'm showing you here not Loie Fuller, as you noticed, but an imitator, Chrissy Sheridan, in a film from 1897. But the film that's depicted in Dixon's cover was actually a film of another Serpentine dancer, another American, Annabelle Whitford. And that film was so popular, they reshot it many times with Annabelle and then with successive Serpentine dances. So dancers. So this is kind of a generic kind of film. In 1892, when the critic Joris Carl Huysman interviewed or reviewed her debut in Paris, he called her strange. He jotted in his journal, quote, mediocre dancing. After all, the glory goes to the electrician. It's American. The identification of Fuller with electricity, and thus by implication Edison, had to do with her elaborate setup of floodlights with constantly changing gels of different colors. And here is a depiction of how it was done. This is in a book called Magic. And here, Annabelle Whitford is being shot in the Edison laboratory. Here's the Chrissy Sheridan that you know very well. And down on the bottom are serial photographs by Harry Ellis of Loie Fuller. We don't know any films of Loie Fuller doing the Serpentine dance herself. What's interesting about the phenomenon of the Serpentine dance, and anybody in Washington who saw the Montmartre show will have seen the French version of this, the Lumiere Brothers, which is the only version that is going to take a minute, is colored, hand-colored. Oh, yeah. Should work. But this is the film. If you know any of the films from this period, you know this film. And of course, in the Lumiere version of it, well, this is the problem. This is a QuickTime file, and Microsoft's PowerPoint will not play it properly the way it will play others. Anyway, you do know that film. What's interesting about the whole Serpentine dance phenomenon is the Toulouse-Lautrec version of Loie Fuller, which emphasizes the colored gels, the colored lights, spotlights that were on her. And then the one film we have of Loie Fuller, or not Loie Fuller, but a Serpentine dancer that's hand-colored, trying to represent those lights. Now, most people saw these films non-hand-colored, in black and white. Oh, did it go? Did it start? Yeah, I'm sorry. Anyway, most people saw them in black and white. And what's interesting to me is the Will Bradley depiction of Serpentine dance from late 1894, which is in black and white. The American version of it is not reflecting the colored gels. And it makes you question for the first time whether an artist is actually seeing the real performance, which would have been in color, or is seeing a black and white film of it. Now, what was the impact in Paris? The most important impact was on the Lumiere family. The Lumieres owned a factory in France that made photographic plates that were used worldwide. They were, so to speak, the Kodaks of France. And when Antoine Lumiere, the father and founder of the company, saw the kinetoscope, he brought, according to the story, to his sons, who are depicted here, Louis and Auguste, a strip of one of the films, the Edison films, referred to as the barbershop, which I only have a still to show you, and handed it over to his sons and said, essentially, we can do better than this. Well, imagine these elegant Frenchmen looking at this barbershop film. American genre painting is like, ew. But it's a real confrontation of French sophistication and the beloved American genre subjects. The Parisian audience would have been familiar with other subjects, like the Buffalo Bill subjects, like the Serpentine Downs subject. It would have been a range of experiences, mostly shockingly American, very, very closely identified with American, whether they were already familiar with these subjects or not. So the Lumiere brothers kick into high gear to create an invention and films that would be the French, and in a nationalistic competition, the French version of this. And so they take from a previous inventor, Georges Denis, the idea of portraiture. In Paris, the inventor most actively involved in moving pictures at this time was Georges Denis. Denis was a sports physiologist who worked closely with Étienne Jules Marais. You're familiar with the physiological studies of Marais, who was Muybridge's counterpart in using stop-action photography to study motion. But Denis split, and Denis' image is on the left here. Denis split with Marais over the concept of moving pictures, Marais seeing little of scientific use for them, and Denis went on to found his own company. Denis focused on the possibilities of moving pictures for portraiture, believing, quote, how happy people would be if they could in an instant see again the living characteristics of a departed person. In the future, the still photograph, fixed in a frame, will be replaced by the animated portrait, which, with a turn of the wheel, will be given life. And this is, I'm showing you an illustration in a scientific magazine of one of his films of a child, but of course in serial form here. The Lumiere brothers went to Denis to learn his technology and try to work out a deal. They didn't work out a deal, but the Lumiere brothers did draw on his emphasis on portraiture and also focused on friends and family rather than the celebrities or stereotypical genre scenes that had driven the Edison series of kinetoscope films by Dixon. The close-up portrait-style scenes of daily life drew on a more contemporary style of art in Paris, and one that would be made famous by, ironically, the American Mary Cassatt. Like the Impressionists, the Lumieres used their own family as subjects in their art and boldly exhibited them for all to see. Throughout 1895, they produced films such as Feeding the Baby, in which Louis Lumiere shoots his brother Auguste and his wife feeding their child. And on December 28, 1895, more than a year after the kinetoscope had been introduced commercially in Paris, they showed them to a commercial audience. But rather than using the individual experience of the viewing cabinet, like the kinetoscope, they projected the films onto a large screen. Within 3 weeks of this introduction, they were drawing 2,000 paying customers a day. Overnight, the art form had changed from a small, intimate world of genre scenes and accomplished physiological displays to a monumental art form in a theatrical setting. Edison followed suit within a few months, and the kinetoscope era of moving pictures was essentially over. In emphasizing the change in format, the Lumieres used the theatrical metaphor for their publicity, showing one of their films as if it were enacted on stage in this poster from 1895. But the connection to art was not yet broken. In the United States, the tradition of seeing films within a fine art context could be seen in the pictorial references of the Edison poster. Even the term moving pictures was entrenched by the end of 1896 in common American parlance. Monumental subjects were soon in demand to fill the increasing sizes of the gold-framed screens now being installed in theaters and opera houses around the world. In the United States, there was no more monumental subject than the American land, particularly its crown jewel, Niagara Falls. The term moving pictures had previously been used to refer to panoramas, and the tradition of vast paintings of vast subjects moved easily into the film medium. And on top is an Edison film of Niagara Falls, and on the bottom, a painting of Niagara Falls by Morris Hunt. I want to say William Morris Hunt, which was intended to be a mural for the State House in Albany. It was a cartoon for a mural. And obviously refers to church, like your church, yes. So this is essentially, from the filmmaker's point of view, a quote-unquote Hudson River landscape. This is a monumental, moving picture. But even though this was the quintessential American subject, the Lumiere Company quickly moved to incorporate this subject into its repertoire, as well as many other distinctively American scenes. And if there was anything equivalent to an American Hudson River School landscape painted or done in Paris, it would be this film. And wouldn't the Lumieres be horrified to know that they had done something so traditionally American? The Lumieres' fine quality and international scope in many ways put the burgeoning American film industry to shame in the late 1890s. And the term cinema, which we use today as a more highfalutin term for moving pictures, comes from the cinematograph, which was the Lumiere term for their invention. But as if the medium were an inherently American art form, the Lumiere Company ceased to compete in the world market after 1900, and the field was dominated, as it is to this day, by the American eye. The kinetoscope period in Paris, lasting a little over a year, was the first chance that any American art form had to rise to the top of the international art world. Thank you.
I want to thank the two parent institutions of this wonderful conference, Sam, as I've learned to say. I knew Uncle Sam, but that's different. And the Terra for hosting this conference and for having me, who is a stranger both to the US, but also to art history, since I come from the perspective of American history or cultural history. I could not agree more with William Mitchell when he says, I quote, "The phrase American photography now has the same ring of inevitability that we associate with French painting, Greek sculpture, Dutch landscape, or Egyptian hieroglyphics, and the same potential for a reduction to a self-evident cliché, the automatic linkage of a nation and a medium," end quote. Humorously describing photography in America as a naturalized and nationalized immigrant from 19th century Europe, Mitchell notes, again I quote, "When photography returns to Paris and the Centre Pompidou, it does so with its passport in hand, a carte de visite inscribed with the signature American photography," end quote. But then, Mitchell reminds us, like the nation, a medium is a cultural institution. In this presentation, I will concur with this idea and suggest that the cultural institution named American photography has not only a domestic history, but also an international one, which in France and in other places as well is coming under increasing scrutiny. By the same token, I will suggest that the history of photography is not so much the history of an autonomous medium, but part of a broader history of images, intrinsically social and international. Now, this talk should really be titled "Slides Towards a History of the Reception of American Photography in France." The title is far too ambitious, and I will just be showing a few moments, a few symptoms, borrowing from recent research, my own and others as well, especially, as you will see, I'm sure, exhibitions and research being done either by or in connection with the American Art Museum in Giverny. I begin with an announcement for a show of Cindy Sherman earlier this year at the Jeu de Paume. Since opening in 2002, this new National Museum of Photography has been showing a large proportion of classic, though mostly post-1960, American photography. This fall, it will show Lee Friedlander and Joel Meyerowitz. The director, Régis Durand, was trained as a specialist of American literature, like myself. But that doesn't mean that his institution is particularly biased in favor of American photographers. Other leading Paris museums have also mounted large shows of American photography in recent years. I'm thinking especially of the 2004 exhibition of Stieglitz and his circle at the Orsay Museum, or last winter's William Klein retrospective at the Pompidou. Still, this institutionalization of American photography is a relatively recent phenomenon, as I will now try to show by presenting a very brief history in 5 stages. The first stage is essentially the second half of the 19th century. And I first turn to the 1867 World Fair in Paris. And in this moment of my show, I will be referring more specifically to research of my own. The World Fair of 1867, which among notable features gathered industry and commerce along with the fine arts under very strictly considered national banners. Here are 2 examples of the relatively modest American contribution to this fair. The US, just emerging from the Civil War, was not fully prepared for this event. The planetarium, which you see at bottom, was actually one of the few American displays that gained much attention. The exposition seemed to confirm the dominant French view that American culture was mostly technical and lacked refinement. Incidentally, this is the context in which Baudelaire coined the word Americanization in French. Here's another stereograph now from the semi-official coverage of the fair by the firm Léon and Lévy, which produced hundreds of these views. The American Fine Arts section was only represented by 2 images, in which the extensive show of American paintings, it was extensive, was completely overshadowed by these relatively bland neoclassical sculptures, including a standing statue of Napoleon. As is known, the American paintings did not fare very well in this exhibition. Now, moving to photography, while Léon and Lévy devoted some views to the French and English photographic sections, none was taken of the American section, which was judged meager and ill-organized. A significant exception was Carlton Watkins's display of large California views, which eventually earned a medal, and which you see in this image, hung in the midst of the American section. It appears that the contribution of California was better prepared than other states, I mean. But of course, in 1867, American photography in Mitchell's sense did not exist. The French, in particular, paid little or no attention to that. In the same period, however, there were sizable arrivals of fine American photographs, or at least photographs that are considered today fine American photographs, in French institutions, especially the Société de Géographie, the Geographical Society, which houses hundreds of stereo views and some large prints from Western explorations, and the Musée de l'Homme, now reopened just this last June as the Musée du Quai Branly, which received, as early as the 1860s, sets of Indian portraits from the Smithsonian-operated Schindler catalog, recently reconstructed so masterfully by Paula Fleming. Clearly, these and other similar sets of images were circulated with a documentary purpose in mind. But this, of course, does not mean that they and their distribution do not belong, at least in my eyes, to the history of American photography. And moreover, the fact that prominent scientists, such as the anarchist geographer Élisée Reclus, collected them and used them as illustrations does not mean that such scientists and erudites did not have an eye for the visual appeal of these pictures. Here you have a photograph, a large print by Hillers, who's one of the survey photographers, donated by Élisée Reclus to the Society of Geography. Views of America, especially in the form of engravings after photographs, as they were called, were widely circulated in France in the last 3 decades of the 19th century, particularly by the publishing firm Hachette and its various magazines. Next year, the American Art Museum in Giverny will host an exhibition of Western survey photography in French collections, which I am working on at the moment. I believe that this exhibition will illustrate an interesting extension of the scope of photographic history, not just the range of relevant pictures and authors, but also the extent of relevant uses and practices. The Western survey photographs may thus come to be regarded as tools for cultural policy, not only at home, but also abroad. And of course, there were many more moments of such cultural policy later in the history that we're following. Moving on to my second moment, as the Stieglitz show at Orsay made clear to French audiences, pictorialism and the photo secession are regarded in the US as the defining moment of photography self-awareness as a medium. Traditionally, however, that story has been told mostly from a New York-centered point of view, with European pictorialist circles taking a backseat to Alfred Stieglitz's driving impulse, and Stieglitz being conversely hailed as a genial importer of the French artistic avant-garde. Recent research, however, suggests that exchanges were more diverse in kind and not so univocal in direction. First, I want to allude to a pet theory of mine by showing you these French Kodak ads, which is that the whole story of the transformation, so-called, of photography into an autonomous art around 1900 in New York can usefully be set against other aspects of what Daniel Burstyn, Neil Harris, and other historians have called the graphic revolution, of which we've just seen another example, of course, with the cinema around 1900. One such aspect is the international Kodak craze, which opened up photography to a much larger practice and identified it socially with leisure and especially with the supposedly light, springy, fun worldview of the upper middle class young mother. Here are then French Kodak ads from the 1900s, which echo very similar American ads, especially the vacation time, 7 Sundays a week. The growth of Eastman Kodak's business in France coincided with an influx of American art photographs, as was particularly well shown in 2003 by Bronwyn Griffith's exhibition, Ambassadors of Progress, revolving around the exhibition of a large body of advanced pictures by American women photographers in Paris in 1900. Quite a few of these women photographers, incidentally, used Kodaks, beginning with Frances Benjamin Johnston, who was their leader, so to speak. The American photographer's display was regarded in Paris as opening new avenues and inspiring a sense of freedom. This is interesting not only as illustration of the assumed and indeed very often approved in France democratic identity of photography, and of American photography especially, but also as evidence of the strategic dimension, or the global dimension at least, of the American crusade for photography. A later stage of the transatlantic photographic dialogue, which I can only mention in passing, is the Surrealist moment, and that too has been highlighted by a recent exhibition at Giverny, Paris' capital of America. Here is Eugene Adjet, and here comes Man Ray, only the two most conspicuous names in a pattern of exchange that in this period became more clearly focused on the Paris-New York polarity and the nascent institutional strategies in those two cities, institutional strategies that are coming under a lot of scrutiny in French photographic historian circles. My third moment is the heyday of photojournalism and the concurring emergence of a history of photography. And here is another subject, the rise of photojournalism especially, which is getting more attention these days. I give you this terrible reproduction of Robert Capa's famous reportage on the Spanish Civil War, merely as a reminder of the fact that Capa, the world's most cosmopolitan photographer probably, liked to introduce himself in Paris as an American photographer, which of course he wasn't. In the years before World War II, the increasing visibility of American illustrated media, which had been since the 19th century the primary carrier of photographs, was enough of a phenomenon to warrant the attention of the first social historians of photography working in France, Walter Benjamin and Gisèle Freund. Here is an image of Gisèle Freund's later, more popular book, which originated, this is 1968, but this book originated in 1936 as a PhD dissertation at the Sorbonne, that is to say the year before Beaumont-Newhall's famous MoMA show on the first 100 years of photography. Freund, who was a photo reporter herself, never gave up her social vision of photography, and for that reason paid close attention before anybody else in France to its mass uses in the US. The phrase les masses médias, the French phrase les masses médias, however, only became current in the wake of Marshall McLuhan's Understanding Media, which was immediately translated in French in the mid-1960s. And here is someone else who nowadays is less often counted among the social critics of photography, Roland Barthes, of course, whose first book, Mythologies, 1957, covered a number of photographic subjects, especially the exhibition The Family of Man, which I will leave to Rob Kroes to tell us all the cultural and ideological meanings of. There's a clear sense in mythology that whatever can be said about photography has little to do with art history, let alone American art history. Nevertheless, by the mid-1960s, other developments had set the stage for a French translation of Beaumont-Newhall's already classic text. Among them, the creation of a photographic collection arranged by auteurs at the Bibliothèque Nationale, where American photographers would come to be well represented. But France was then, and still is today in some ways, lagging behind, in quotation marks, the US in the recognition of photography. But from 1970 on, this became an increasing concern, which soon benefited American photography. Moving on. It is beyond my purpose today to detail the French boom on American photography that accompanied the larger boom on photography in the 1970s, and which is, I must confess, very much part of my own autobiography as a researcher of American photography. I merely want to note that in this period, where French opinion on American culture was as divided as ever, a consensus seems to have formed on the notion that American photography embodied the best of photography, had become, in short, American photography in Mitchell's sense of, Greek sculpture and Egyptian hieroglyphics. Here are two very different examples. I'm first giving you two slides of the popular Photo magazine, now defunct, showing that in the late 1970s, canonization of American masters was not incompatible with the rehearsing of a more popular image of America, and even in this case, a titillating one. And now something perhaps more striking for you, a paste up of 7 illustrations from Barthes' famous book, La Chambre Claire, Camera Lucida, 1980, all of them photographs by recognized American masters. Stieglitz, Avedon, James Van Der Zee, Lewis Hine, William Klein, Mapplethorpe, two Mapplethorpe in the bottom right. Indeed, nearly 1/2 of the book's iconography is American. And there would be a lot to say about the image of American photography, and let alone the image of America that transpires from this assemblage. What matters here is that Barthes, though probably not adhering blindly to a photographic canon, resorted heavily to American photographs in his exploration of the so-called essence of photography. My next slides show the expansion in the 1980s of a specialized discourse on American photography, both in photographic magazines and elsewhere, such as the art magazine Art Press, and on the right, the French American Studies Review, and a special issue on American photography. Since 1980, the Mois de la Photo, Photography Month, a biennial festival of photography, has routinely featured countless exhibits of American photographers, as did the older Rencontres d'Arles. The exact course of this French adoption of an American photographic pantheon, as well as, it should be mentioned, the support, often quite original, of emerging American photographers, remains to be charted. It is clear that some influential critics and circles had a role, as did also some prominent collectors and dealers. And I'm coming back to the present and some concluding remarks. I come back to the present because it looks like, in some ways, a new stage in the acceptance and exposure of American photography. I have already mentioned that since the end of the 1990s, nearly every major French museum has been showing photography in one way or another, and that American photographers have been shown at the Orsay, the Jeux de Paume, the Maison Européenne de la Photographie, which is the city of Paris's rival institution to the Jeux de Paume, and in several museums outside of Paris. I want to make two remarks here. One is based on the reception of the show Made in USA, an exhibition of American modernism organized by the French-American Regional Museum Network, FRAME, curated by Éric de Chassey, who is an art historian and a specialist of American modernism, and shown in 3 French cities in 2002. What struck me on visiting that show was that viewers in Bordeaux or in Rennes displayed familiarity with photographs by Lewis Hine or Walker Evans, while passing by, indeed bypassing, the paintings of Arthur Dove or Joseph Stella, and I witnessed the same phenomenon in Paris at the Orsay show of Stieglitz's Circle. When Éric de Chassey provocatively asked in the catalogue, why was there no great art in America before abstract expressionism, the French public might have answered, well, because there already was photography, American photography. The other remark is that even in the age of American photography turned cultural icon, this icon is not impervious to non-artistic readings of all kinds, to the extent that even art museums will sanction displays of American photography with a broad, indeed an obscure meaning. I am thinking here of the show Photography in the American Dream, based on the collection of Stephen White and created by the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. This show focused on so-called vernacular photography, but precisely for this reason, the catalog, which was prefaced by none other than Bill Clinton, offered every possible reinforcement of the cliché associated in photography and American culture at large. Meanwhile, the show tended to emphasize a rather bleak view of the American dream, suggesting, as has often been done in France, that photography had as much to do with debunking that dream as it did with embodying or constructing it. Coming a few months after 9/11, images such as this one, illustrating a section called The City Rises, were laden with an unintended irony that may have had something to do in a perverse way with the show's success in France. Meanwhile, more serious endeavors, such as the Paris Capital of America show at Giverny on American modernism in Paris, confirmed the high standing of American photography in the serious history of transatlantic exchanges, as well as the already alluded to advantage of American photography over American painting in the eyes of the French public. I cannot avoid, in closing, the question whether the incorporation of American photography in French museums reflects another onset of cultural imperialism. Unquestionably, art photography, especially American, has now become a very valuable investment. And many shows tour around the world to generate a return on that investment. Incidentally, only a portion of the shows that I have mentioned were created or curated by French museums. In this connection, my hope is that French and other nations' museums may gather the means and the will to produce more of their own shows of American art, and let me add, of visual culture in general. For photography is not only a well-established province of our history, and American photography the most esteemed sector of that province. Photography is now emerging as something broader, as the cornerstone of a global history of images, which art history itself is now considering with increasing attention. The fact that American images, to use that catch-all phrase, occupy conspicuous positions in this history makes it all the more desirable that these American images should be envisioned in a truly global approach. Thank you.
In New York, and when it traveled, and which it no longer is in the catalog, which reduces this spatial, three-dimensional installation to the serial, two-dimensional projection of photographs on pages of a book. Yet, remarkably, that catalog has been continuously available since the mid-50s. You can still order it, buy it, find it. It's still available. In the history of its reception, I have chosen to focus only on the recent revisits. Now that the show is on permanent display, it has remarkably elicited new views, new confrontations, new ways of reading the messages implied in the show from the moment it first opened in New York. And let me take you then to several voices of critics that in revisiting the show have engaged in a dialogue with earlier forms of criticism and critique and reflection on the show's meanings. And the first voice then is Marian Hersh's, who, in taking a fresh look at the family of man, places the show in the context of her explorations of family photographs. She recognizes many features of the genre in the exhibition, such as the familial gaze, the specularity in the exchange of glances, with people being looked at, looking back, engaging the viewer in conversation. When others, like Alan Sekula, had seen this as a ploy for the collapse of the political into the familial, they sided with those critics like Susan Sontag or Roland Barthes, who see the show as a sentimental conjuring trick, naturalizing the representation of mankind in disregard of historical context and politics. Hersh sees things differently. Quasi-familial as the gaze of the exhibition may seem to be, there is a fundamental imbalance in the direction of the gaze. Hersh recognizes an underlying imperialism in the exhibition. What it presents is an established European and American way of looking at the world and ordering it in an overall picture. People from the third world are present in the show, but never through self-representation. They are the objects of a Western gaze. Thus, Hersh reintroduces politics in her reflections. She wonders what the show would have looked like if third world people had trained their lenses, had they had any, on themselves and on the West. It would have restored a balance in the exchange of glances, as she sees it, through the empowerment of the camera lens. Now, as she puts it, and I quote her, the space of identification offered by Steichent's show is the space enjoyed by the Western European and European American bourgeois nuclear family, a space which others could only vicariously share by looking in from outside. Precisely such a sense of outsidership, of having been turned into spectacle for Western eyes to behold, may have been behind the protest of an African student in Moscow when the show on its travels had reached that city. He tore up several pictures when the show was on display there, claiming it represented the third world as poor and primitive compared to the West. Yet others in Moscow and elsewhere saw it in a different light. Hersh's reading seems unduly reductive of the options for identification that the exhibition provided. In a telling digression, she acknowledges as much when she ponders how she would have viewed the show if it had come to Romania, where she grew up, and I quote her again. "Had my family and I seen the exhibit, however, we would certainly have identified with its message of universal brotherhood." Her parents' Austrian Jewish upbringing on Heinrich Heine and Stefan Zweig, their recent history of persecution, and their minority status as German-speaking Jews in Romania would have made them ideal visitors to the family of man. And again, I quote her, "Even the contradictions in our mentality would have been reflected in the images. The belief in human equality on the one hand, and on the other, our own sense of cultural superiority as Western Europeans displaced in the Balkans, as well as our fragile bourgeois comfort, all correspond to the mentality of Steichen's human family. The space of identification is the space enjoyed by the Western European and European American bourgeois nuclear family, a space to which we were close enough that by the logic of the family romance, we could imagine, desire ourselves into it. In the aftermath of the Nazi deportations, the image of a close-knit nuclear family would itself have inspired us as a sanctuary to be cherished and protected. An ideal made up of humanity, familiality, and universal communication would surely have found resonance. End of quote. In this exercise in the joys of vicarious identification with the show's message, of people looking in from outside, Hersh suggests at least one of the many ways in which people the world over might have enjoyed the show in private control of their individual reading. The ultimate empowerment, I wish to argue, is in the eye of the beholder, in the choices he or she makes, identifying with all these open faces from all over the world, looking us into the eye. The enjoyment of the millions of spectators is in the final analysis, the black box containing all the mysteries of appropriation, private perception, and identification. No critic interposing him or herself in the field of vision has the authority to speak on behalf of the audience without asking them. That, as I see it, is what the critical empowerment of the spectator is all about. As for the interaction between spectators and the many faces represented in the show's photographs, the family of man has spawned its own progeny. There is a rich album of photographs showing spectators immersing themselves in the photographs in an exchange of glances, establishing, as it were, eye contact with fellow members of the family of man. Many of these photographs were taken at the behest of USIA as the show was touring the world, as proof and testimony of its public appeal and appreciation. Edward Steichen himself contributed to this collection with photographs he took when the exhibition was on show in Moscow. Such documents give a visual hint, at least, of the ways in which individual spectators communed with individual photographs. What helped foreign audiences empathize was the fact that photographs from 68 different countries were on display. Thus, in one telling case, we can see Queen Juliana of the Netherlands, easily the most motherly of monarchs, viewing Dutch photographer Emmy Andries's picture of an elderly rural couple, fellow Dutch people, illustrating Ovid's dictum that we too are a multitude. Much of the criticism that in my longer version I touch on and analyze, much of the criticism was in response to the original MoMA exhibition or the accompanying catalogue. There is little reference to the Cold War context other than its inclusion of the threat of nuclear annihilation. The threat was generalized, though, not explicitly connected to the agency of parties confronting each other in the Cold War. If agency was suggested in the show, it was of a countervailing kind. One of the final images shows the United States General Assembly as the site for heads of families to sort out their differences peacefully. To the extent that the show's implied political frame of mind was criticized, as in Hersh's critique of the imperial gaze that structured the representation of humanity, we recognize much older lines of a critique of ideology, revisiting earlier mass cultural events, such as the Chicago 1893 World's Fair or Buffalo Bill's Wild West Show. Historians have consistently pointed up the implied strategies of self-representation of Western civilization, European and American, as the pinnacle of progress and development, with the rest of the world seen as mired in earlier, more primitive stages in the onward march of civilization. Clearly, from the moment that USIA took the show under its wing and sent it traveling, Cold War propaganda uses affected the framework of perception. Not surprisingly, some reviews of the show at its various stops in European cities addressed the propaganda issue more explicitly than had earlier American comments. Yet in general, the show was a great public success. Its stature was enhanced by the fact that in many places, museums hosted the show. Press comments on the whole reflected the public response. The positive reception of the exhibition may in part be due to the fact that many European countries were represented in the images, often by photographers from their own countries. It helped people meaningfully to connect to the larger message of the show from their national perspectives and affiliations. Remarkably, with the Cold War behind us, the diverse history of readings of Steichen's Family of Man continues. The show, as I already mentioned, has found its final and permanent home in Steichen's country of origin, Luxembourg. It is on permanent display in the castle of Clairvaux, in a reconstruction of the form in which it toured so many countries for so long. Rather than as a mere relic or a posthumous tribute to Steichen as its auctor intellectualis, eliciting nostalgia for its remembered meanings, it goes on to stimulate new readings. A remarkable recent collection of essays revisits the show in an acknowledgement of its continuing power to speak to current concerns and anxieties. In one essay, Victoria Schmidt-Linsenhof engages the exhibit in terms not of its Cold War relevance, but of what it has to say about the European trauma of the Holocaust, or the Shoah, as she prefers to call it. Re-encountering the exhibit at Clairvaux, one picture with which she was very familiar due to her earlier work on photography by the Nazi henchmen, as she put it, took her breath away. The photograph from the Jürgen Stroop report on the destruction of the Warsaw Ghetto was presented in such a way as to conceal and at the same time highlight. Oh, how do I get back? To conceal and at the same time highlight the absence of the Shoah as the invisible center of the exhibition. It led her to a reinterpretation of the Family of Man as a symptom of the legacy of the Shoah in conjunction with the trauma theories in the arts and humanities, which have increasingly come under discussion since the mid-1990s. Given the mass exposure to pictures of Nazi terror following the liberation of concentration camps in the final days of World War II, the relative silence of Steichen's exhibit on the Nazi infamy appeared as only one case of the more general repression of a collective mass memory of this ultimate horror. Following the early flood of photographs and books documenting the Nazi horrors, a silence set in, enveloping both survivors and the body of former fellow citizens to which they had returned. There was a shared sense of picking up the thread of life that had been ruptured by the war, of resuming life as if nothing had intervened to break it. But the repression of trauma comes at a terrible price. From the late 1960s onward, there was a return of the repressed with a vengeance. Many succumbed to what came to be known as the concentration camp syndrome. Some managed creatively to translate the return of traumatic memories into writing, as in the case of Dutch author Gerhard Durlacher. Following an attempt to return to normal civilian bourgeois life in the Netherlands as a survivor of Nazi concentration camps, only psychiatric treatment helped him to veer back to life from a deep depression and to harness the flood of returned memories in magisterial writing. He, like many others, such as French filmmaker Claude Lanzmann, brought back to public awareness what the larger public in Europe and America had known all along but had chosen to forget. Edward Steichen mounted his Family of Man exhibit at the high point of this collective endeavor in forgetfulness. In his case, authorial intent rather than amnesia, or the willful repression of traumatic images, must have guided him in the final selection of photographs. In the 2 years of preparation for the exhibit, he must have gone over many of the concentration camp pictures that had circulated widely a mere 8 years before. The photographs of Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen by Margaret Bork-White, Lee Miller, and George Roger were in the archives from which the majority of the material for the Family of Man was taken. Yet, rather than include any of Lee Miller's photographs of heaps of corpses in Dachau, Steichen selected Miller's moving image of a child and a cat as part of the closing section of the exhibition on children. Only one panel, in the section on man's inhumanity to man, may have served to trigger the visual archive of the unconscious in the minds of the show's visitors. And what I show here is taken from the catalogue and is highly unrepresentative of that particular panel in the show. On that panel, you see 2 photographs of the Warsaw Ghetto burning and Jews being expelled from there, taken to extermination camps. And that photograph commandingly is put on top of those 2 photographs of terror, not as in the catalogue, for reasons unknown to me, in sort of a lower left-hand corner where it loses its impact. But let me then talk about the panel as it is now on display in Clairvaux. 2 photographs on that panel show men, women, and children being led at gunpoint out of the burning Warsaw Ghetto before being herded by the Germans to their deaths in the Treblinka extermination camp. The 3rd photograph at the top of the panel is a photograph taken in Israel in 1951. It shows a black-haired woman in dark clothing, her emaciated arm raised aloft in a monumental gesture, the fingers eloquently splayed in a spiritual cry of outrage. The composition gives the impression that this woman is not only bewailing the suffering in the Warsaw Ghetto, but is triumphing over it. Centrally placed on the panel is a text quoted from Georges Sand: "Humanity is outraged in me and with me. We must not dissimulate nor try to forget this indignation, which is one of the most passionate forms of love." Text and photographs together indicate that the image of the woman is an allegory of the state of Israel, a state whose origins lay in the suffering of innocent victims and which was retrospectively invested with the spirit and dignity of the founding sacrificial victims. Thus, recontextualizing the images, Steichen imbues them with new meaning, connecting past trauma with future hopes. In this suturing approach, stitching past and future together, Steichen may at points seem to deny the intervening horror, and he has been blamed for doing that, when, for instance, he shows 2 pictures by Roman Wiśniak and Margaret Bork-White of Jewish schools in Poland and Czechoslovakia from the 1930s. But I would argue that Steichen's narrative ploy here is rather the soothing creation of a cyclical time of salvation, a circle whose closure consists precisely in salvaging visual traces of a past that otherwise has been violently annihilated. Thus, The Family of Man deals with the Shoah only through subtle recontextualization, never confronting the viewer directly with Nazi atrocity photographs. Yet, as Victoria Schmidt-Linsenhof argues, there are ways in which we can see Steichen's entire project as addressing issues of racism and genocide. If the exhibition can be considered the qualitative pinnacle of a stylistic genre known as human interest photography, Steichen at the same time deconstructed the genre. As a genre, it had discovered the particular and the non-representative, the anecdotal. Steichen, though, chose to bend it toward his neo-humanist purposes. He rhythmically punctuated the sequences of images of everyday life with archaic natural images of biblical force, obliterating the sensitivity to the human interest in the photographs. Thus, as Schmidt-Linsenhof puts it, and I agree, this systematic inversion from the particular to the universal, from profane to sacred, from visual serendipity to divine plan for creation, clearly points to the horror unleashed by the senseless destruction of life for its own sake, a horror which the exhibition addresses without showing the horrific images. Steichen's entire vision can then be understood as one frantic attempt to send out a message of never again. Thank you.
We've run a bit long, but Cindy tells me we can have about 10 minutes or so of questions or discussion or comments. And if you do have any, I can't see quite well from where I'm standing, but please go to the microphones, and if you could identify yourselves and ask, is there somebody? Oh, there's someone. Okay, fair enough. Please.
I'm Marian Hersh. I direct an art program for the Federal Reserve Board. I had the pleasure of mounting an exhibition of Steichen's paintings. A question about The Family of Man. What do we know about Steichen's brother-in-law's role in the selection of photographs? Did Steichen ask Sandberg for his input on the selection of photographs? And did the USIA ask Steichen to change any of the selection of photographs?
Sandberg played an important role in the whole project. Although he was on the FBI list with a C ranking, communist, Steichen couldn't be bothered about that. He included photographers who were blacklisted from the Photo League in New York. And there were several daring elements in the way that he selected the photographs. Sandberg's role was mostly in the literary side, in selecting from world literature these quotations to set the tone for the reading of photographs brought together on a particular panel. He was not involved really with the selection of pictures himself. Then the role of USIA. There had already been changes while the show was on display at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. There was initially a photograph of a lynched black man that was taken out as being too strong, too jarring with the tone of the message that the other photographs conveyed. So it was taken out. And when it traveled as the show that had been on display in the Museum of Modern Art, with a few occasional changes. the gripping final color, what's the technical term? A slide? Yes, of a nuclear cloud. The one color photograph in the entire show, the one color picture in the entire show, the rest was black and white, reinforced its impact of the danger overhanging the family of man and mankind. That photograph, that color transparency of the nuclear threat didn't go to Japan when the show was sent there. And there are several other relatively marginal, this was not marginal, this really affected the central reading of the show when it went to Japan, but there are several other cases of photographs taken out when receiving countries came with complaints. But that's the length and breadth of the US-IA role in affecting the message.
Please.
First, my name is Wendy Grossman. I teach at George Washington University here in DC, and as a photo historian, I'm particularly interested and want to thank you all for a really stimulating panel. It's hard to sort of figure out where to jump in, but I actually want to jump into a little teeny corner and of this question of American images in a global context. And I hope that my question will sort of complicate the narrative and engage in some of the issues here, and that is particularly to François. I'd like to ask you the question is, who owns Man Ray? And I ask that in particularly in your wonderful, I mean, it's amazing what you covered in the scope of the reception of American photography, but I ask that as a Man Ray scholar who, A, has consistently been told I'm not an Americanist because I'm working on Man Ray, and B, the fact that with most Americans, Man Ray is French, and indeed in one of these initial photographs of his that came published in the first exhibition of modern European photography in 1930 in New York, Man Ray's Noir et Blanche was introduced by a French photographer as being from a French photographer, and at the same time, he falls through the cracks because in much of American art history, he is viewed as a Frenchman. And his work doesn't fit into the boxes or the categories or the frames of American art history. So I think that perhaps looking at that as a microcosm of some of the complications or the conundrums that we face with some of these categories, I just would be interested in your perception of sort of that reception of Man Ray as an example of some of these complications.
Well, I would return the question, who owns Eugène Adjé? Exactly. I chose those two figures as precisely, I think, as illustrations of a fairly singular moment in the very sketchy history that I gave, when precisely because of that particular cluster of people, of course mostly centered in Paris, and their transatlantic interactions and connections, that there is this dialogue which goes certainly both ways. And it's, yes, I mean, I can't place Man Ray either there or here. So what's emerging now, I think, is that whereas that history has been told mostly from the point of view of artists and art circles, what's emerging now is investigations into the parallel, less visible actions and transactions of emerging institutions, and perhaps not so much institutions as much as collectors and galleries, such as Julien Lévy. That period is the 20s, is perhaps until now relatively less known in terms of the institutional history of photography, but I think that's soon to change. But also I wanted to add that, as you could tell from my talk, that they were, both Adjé and Man Ray are kind of meteors in my narrative, because I didn't focused very much on individual artists, and so, but that's also what makes them singular.
If I may just add to the institutional issue, I think the fact of the role of reproduction and the fact that so many of these photographs became known first through that context, which sort of complicates the,
Yes.
the reception. But thank you.
Please.
I have a question for Rob Kroes about the Family of Man exhibit. I'm wondering if the new exhibit or the permanent exhibition of Family of Man in Luxembourg maintains the original scale of Steichen's images. And I remember from some of the early controversy, or I don't personally remember, but from some of the original controversy around the show from artists and others had to do in part with the freewheeling way in which Steichen dealt with photography, and that he blew up images that weren't originally supposed to be that size, and he was quite bold in that making that move, and that on the one hand that de-aestheticizes the images and moves away from the early precious discussion of photography of the photo secessionists from which he moved and got into great problems with Stieglitz about, but it also depoliticizes the photographs on some level, but it does commercialize the photographs on another level when they're that large and so out of scale, and perhaps politicizes them in another direction. But I just wonder if in any of the recent discussion around the new installation, issues of scale and how that relates to the whole notion of the abuses and uses of photography as they relate to scale are implied. So.
Yeah, what they tried to do in Clairvaux was be true to the initial scale and format of the exhibition, although given the castle that was offered, they had to divide it over 2 floors rather than have it fill one room with its designed flow of spectators from one image to another image, while being able to look back and look forward, and all the ideas of peripheral vision and how you should glance these photographs and connect them consciously or not so consciously. All these ideas that initially informed Steichen's floor plan in MoMA, they tried to repeat in Clairvaux, but it strikes you as a visitor that it's on a more intimate scale because it's cut up over 2 floors, but it still works. It still tries to do what the initial show did. You're absolutely right, and many of the photographers included in the show, particularly Ansel Adams, made a statement to that effect, that he blamed Steichen, who had come from the fine print tradition in American photography, was close to Stieglitz at one point early in his own career, that he had given up on that fine print aesthetics for this particular show, where he only asked the selected photographers to send negatives of the pictures, leaving him free to do with them, blow them up, choose the scale as he saw fit, which is a strange thing to do, paradoxical thing to do for someone with Steichen's background. Yet that is, he didn't care much about the fine print aesthetics for this particular show, choosing an impact that had to do more with, well, the spatial installation quality of the show and the format of certain of these biblical naturalist pictures. And altogether, he used photographers for a story that he wanted to tell, which is no longer so easy to do when you set up when you set up a photography show. There was not much deference or esteem for all these individual artists involved. Yet, and that's a point I make on other pages that I didn't have the time to present here. The amazing thing is that so many of these pictures manage to preserve their power in spite of what Steichen had done to them. And that is how many people remember the show, as if, for many people, this was a first exposure to the power of photography. They had never gone to museums to see a photography show before in their lives. And for many people, it was an experience that lasted as memory for the rest of their lives in many cases.